If I were to ask you to describe a fantasy world, you'd probably talk about dragons and magic, or maybe dwarves and elves that have lived thousands of years. Fantasy is an incredibly established genre and setting. It's been played out time and time again. Yet somehow it still feels like in a lot of ways fantasy hasn't been explored properly. So often a range of different stories, especially those in the fantasy genre, will introduce characters that have lived for thousands of years, yet somehow they never properly explore what that would be like, the difficulties that those characters would face, and how their minds would cope with everything around them dying so quickly. You could probably make a whole story just about that. Well, it turns out they did. Frieren Beyond Journeys End is one of the most popular, successful, and critically acclaimed anime that's aired in the last 5 years. It feels completely singular, constantly subverting fantasy norms and trope while also being a beautiful homage to the genre as a whole. It reminded me that I don't hate fantasy, I've just been waiting for someone to do it much better. It's a story of an elf that's lived an incredibly long life, but within that it explores deeply human themes like regretting the way you've used your time or the value of connection. So today we're going to talk about fantasy as a genre, the first episode of Frieren, and then how this show explores the philosophy of time and immortality. In fiction, the only limits are our creativity, and fantasy is theoretically a prime example of that. Yet despite its namesake, it feels like so often fantasy doesn't invoke very much of the fantastic. It's a genre filled with trope and standard, one where core to its nature is building new worlds, yet somehow we always end up with the same old boring one. But even if you weren't going to explore the other paths of what a fantasy world could be, you could still get more out of the fantasy world we know. Think of how many stories have elves that lived thousands of years, yet somehow they never actually feel like they've lived longer than the protagonists around them. In the media I've consumed, elves always fill the role as a side character that's never properly fleshed out, which is why the premise of Frieren appeals to me a lot, especially as a show that explores philosophical questions and the human condition. Today we're going to be primarily focusing on the first episode of Frieren Beyond Journeys End. And like its namesake indicates, the story starts at the end, in this case of the hero's journey, the fight to save the world, where the party of 4 adventurers defeated the Demon King, overcoming an overwhelming evil, ushering in an era of prosperity and peace. And during the celebration, the heroes observe a meteor shower, one that happens every 50 years. While everyone stares up at its beauty, Frieren shares that there's a place she knows that has a much better view, and they all promise to eventually see it together. Shortly after, Frieren decides to go on her own and says her farewells. Like many other shows, there's a montage that indicates the passing of time. Except with these, they're filled with overwhelmingly beautiful shots. When you put something together that really works and is fantastic, you want to highlight it as much as you possibly can, but the sign of a good project is understanding the limits of a shot and when to cut away. There's so much care and thought behind every scene, and this is a tool that they consistently lean on throughout the series. And as silly as it sounds, the ability to put together a remarkable montage is incredibly important for this show, because a major part of what makes Frieren Beyond Journeys End so captivating is the way they show Frieren's experience to the audience. Because think about it for a second, how do you capture what it would be like to live thousands of years? Why tell the audience when you can show them? The montage feels brief, like a blink in the grand scheme of things, but by the time our protagonist finds herself back in the capital city, everything around her has changed drastically. The party of young and beautiful adventurers has now aged. Himmel the hero and Hyder the priest, the 2 humans of the group, are approaching the end of their lives. With 50 years that has passed, the party sets out to fulfill their promise, to see the meteor shower in Frieren's special spot. And as they set out on their final adventure, we get a beautiful montage with remarkable animation and outstanding music. This show does not rush, yet despite that it covers such drastic amounts of time. And before we know it, we find the party at Himmel's funeral, and Frieren finds herself crying. Whether it's people's fear of death or their fascination at the idea of an endless amount of time to spend on the things they love, living forever is often assumed to be a blessing. But I believe in reality it's more of a curse. Human beings often like to think of time as an objective thing, and based off of our understanding, there are some objective components of time. No matter how much you want it to stop, it will always move forward. And we know that time doesn't affect everything equally. Take, for example, time dilation. 2 clocks, one on Earth and one traveling fast on a space station in orbit, will tick at different rates. Time is not as objective as humans assume, and thus ignoring perception of time. Everyone can relate to time flying by or moments dragging. As you get older, time seems to pass quicker because it makes up a smaller percentage of your life. 4 years means something very different to an adult than a child. So how might a being's perception of time be influenced if they were to live thousands of years? The first obvious answer is that there would be less urgency. A popular philosophical argument that I subscribe to is part of the reason human beings care about things is because they're finite. The limits and hardships of life are part of the reason human beings can find it so fulfilling. That's why I think that if someone were to live thousands of years in a world of people that live hundreds at max, that experience would be cursed unless combated by mindfulness and effort. I don't think someone who is immortal is destined to live an unhappy life. I just think it would be significantly harder to find satisfaction and happiness. And one of the primary reasons I believe that would be the case is because everything around you would die so quickly. All of these ideas are explored in Frieren Beyond Journeys End. Part of the reason I think this pilot stood out so much is because it was able to tell such a compelling story in such a short amount of time. And while it's exploring a lot of these really interesting ideas, I don't think it's very heavy-handed. This show is expert at exploring ideas subtly. For example, this episode teaches us a lot about the story they're gonna tell, and more specifically our main character, Frieren, who's incredibly disconnected from the world around her, which is either in her nature or a byproduct of her having to cope with her circumstance. Realistically, think what it would be like to have all the people you know across your lifetime that make up small percentages of your total time pass away around you. In Frieren, elves fill this nomadic culture where they don't have a centralized location where they live. The reduced draw to have children compared to humans or other creatures results in a very sparse society. There's actually a natural phenomena of this, where the longer an animal lives, the less children it's likely to have. It's really solid world building, but also it plays beautifully in the fact that Frieren is isolated. There's this cool decision to have Frieren be occupied by her pursuit of magic. We won't talk about it much, but the second episode of Frieren is titled "It Didn't Have to Be Magic," because ultimately what Frieren needed was some sort of purpose to her life. She has a hobby of collecting spells and exploring the world around her because it's her way of coping and finding purpose in a world that's not built for her. But in losing Himmel and realizing she wished she had connected with him better, we're introduced to the closest thing to what could be conflict for the story, which is Frieren's pursuit of connection, no matter how brief, because I believe that would be the ultimate difficulty of living a functionally immortal life, the difficulties of connection. The constant and consistent exposure to the loss of anyone and everyone you love. This show is magical, completely changing my mind on what I think fantasy is capable of and exploring an incredibly interesting idea in an entertaining and deep way. This video is the start of a running series I'm doing where I'm going to be going through Frieren episode by episode and finding unique ideas to make videos about. Come back next week for another. If you enjoyed this video and want to support me, I have some exclusive video essays on Patreon. There's currently 3 up there, but I have some more on the way. Link in the description below. Thank you. See you next week.